Today we've come together in the Medical History Museum, one of the very special spaces at the University of Melbourne. The museum has many unique holdings, among which are a number of items that relate directly to John Cade, the University of Melbourne medical graduate, and his 1948 discovery of lithium as a valuable treatment in bipolar disorder. At the time of doing his research, John Cade was in his mid-30s, and since graduating, had worked in general and mental hospitals and had been a prisoner of war in the notorious Changi prisoner of war camp in Singapore for a long 3.5 years. His research discovery was of enormous significance in the history of medicine because lithium was the first medication anywhere in the world to be useful in treating a specific form of mental illness. It's been described as ushering in the modern era of psychopharmacology in psychiatry. 75 years after John Cade first identified lithium's intriguing effects, it remains in widespread use today, especially in individuals whose bipolar disorder is at the severe end of the spectrum. Our expert informants for this podcast are firstly John Cade's oldest son, Jack, also a doctor, but in this case in the field of intensive care medicine, and secondly, Greg de Moore, who trained in medicine at the University of Melbourne and who works as a psychiatrist at Sydney's Westmead Hospital. Greg and I worked together to write the biography Finding Sanity, John Cade, Lithium and the Taming of Bipolar Disorder, published in 2016. I'll start by asking you, Jack, about the personal qualities that you observed in your father after he returned from the Second World War and started conducting studies on patients at the Bundoora Hospital.
Well, thanks, Anne. My father was quite clearly a very intelligent man with an amazing curiosity for the natural world. But he'd also had a very strong medical training at the University of Melbourne. And indeed, he'd obtained his MD as a postgraduate, which was in those days the physician postgraduate qualification. But in addition, because his father had been medical superintendent at a number of mental hospitals, as a young man, he'd been exposed to a whole variety of patients, ambulatory patients with mental illness. So he was very familiar with mentally ill patients whom he saw as human beings, not as some sort of incarcerated species. But finally, and probably one of the most significant, was his experiences in Changi as a prisoner of war, which you've alluded to, which was a horrific experience for them all. But for him particularly, emphasised the mind-body connection of health and illness. And so that combination, I think, was apparent to us all at that time. And his first job in psychiatry was as the sole doctor at Beechworth Asylum. And he actually did ward rounds to see all the patients. And the matron said, "You don't need to come and see the patient. I'll call you if there's a problem." But no, he saw them all. And he found this extraordinary collection of people with physical illnesses, myxedema, pellagra, scurvy, that had impacted on their mental health, but were physically curable.
And in some ways, again, I think Cade was just so well ahead of his time, because now, in the early 21st century, one of the biggest topics for research is the physical welfare of psychiatric patients. But here he was at Beechworth in the 1930s, looking at exactly the same thing. And I think it was really during that time that he came across the vitamin C deficiency.
That's right.
And I think that was a tremendous and perhaps a little known discovery of his.
So, Greg, in our book, Lithium is likened to the penicillin of mental health. Can you explain to the audience what is meant by that?
So there's actually a phrase I came up with, I think, during an interview, and I was trying to find a way of emphasizing the impact of lithium. And I felt that that would be something that everyone would understand immediately by calling it the penicillin of mental health. And for me, it's really the introduction of penicillin, that antibiotic that changed really the way we managed infectious disease. Lithium, in many ways, is exactly the same. So lithium is the first effective medication for a specific mental illness, Australian discovery, of course. And it's the forerunner of a whole range of other medications in the following 10 to 12 years. But not only does it change the way for bipolar illness and depression was treated, it also changed the way I think we thought about mental illness, in that here was something biological, a chemical, indeed something not concocted, something actually natural, that could come in and profoundly improve the welfare of mankind by treating this illness. And I think it changed the way we looked at mental illness, that there was indeed a biological underpinning to it. And I think that opened up a world which we might now in the 21st century just assume was always the case. But in Cade's time, that wasn't the case. I mean, there was a strong psychoanalytic movement that looked very much at how you were brought up. I think the introduction of lithium really emphasised the biology of mental illness.
Did you grow up with that awareness that your father was perhaps not recognised for something quite significant in the history of psychiatry?
Well, not really. I remember the experiments well, the guinea pigs, the whole origin of this. But as we grew up, he was just Dad. He went to work and did things. But the enormity of the discovery and the eminence didn't occur to us until it was finally recognised over 20 years later in the United States, the other side of the world, and he went off to receive an award, an international award. We thought, crikey, what's he done? So he went off to America to get this award from President Nixon at the time. Turned out to be President Ford in the end because Nixon had been impeached. And he went to America to get this award, and we were quite astonished. But this was our first awareness.
I have to admit, I spent a year at Cornell University Medical Center, and it was in Manhattan, and they had a grand rounds on lithium, and they had a very eminent speaker talking about lithium. And in the dinner afterwards, I just happened to mention that John Cade was the discoverer of lithium for bipolar disorder in the 1940s. And you could have heard a pin drop because no one knew what I was talking about. John who? Australia?
He's a very modest man, and that was his nature.
Just pick this up. And when I first saw this photo, I said to people I know, you could almost tell that there's a certain self-effacing, humble quality about him.
That's right.
And I imagine that's partly his personality. I also wondered, Jack and Anne, whether it was partly to do with his experiences in Changi, whether certainly the men I interviewed who had been in Changi, I don't know about yourself, Anne, but none of them were boastful. They were very matter of fact, and I thought they were all very humble about their achievements. But I thought this is the classic photo, I think, of your dad, or at least classic in my mind.
Yeah.
And I think this was taken in 48.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, 1948.
So
just the time he was treating his first patient.
Yes,
with you.
contemporaneous. That's taken at the front of the Bandura house.
You know, when we talk about this to groups, that's the one line, if you like, that brings the biggest laugh about how John would ask nursing staff and others to collect urine from patients with manic depression, bring back the urine and put them in the family fridge, And I always have this image of you and your brother coming back from school and looking for the butter and having to push aside, these bottles of urine. And when I asked you, didn't you think it was odd? You responded by saying, well, we just thought everyone's father collected urine and put it in bottles and stuff.
Indeed, indeed.
Because, of course, urine was one of those things that's a very available way to monitor the body at a time when there weren't a lot of ways to monitor the
Indeed,
body.
indeed.
These are just wonderful records of what happened back in the 1940s. So there were 10 manic patients that were treated with lithium. And the first of these is Bill Brand, and I'm holding his treatment sheet there. And it's just a series of dates with one line describing what John Cade was doing, the name of the patient, the date, how much lithium he was giving the patient. A very succinct description of how it affected the patient. In fact, precision and being succinct seem to mark everything that Cade did, for me anyhow. I know that, Jack, you knew Bill Brand.
Yes, he was well known around the Bundoora Hospital as well, we always thought he was lovely as kids because he was obviously eccentric. He was extremely grubby, restless, but very interesting. And we'd chat to him and share lollies with him, and etc. And then one day he disappeared. We found it after all these years. He'd been sent home, cured, which was. We didn't register that this was a sort of pharmacological miracle at the time. We just thought that was wonderful.
And with Bill Brand, of course, he began his treatment in 1948, and within 2.5 months, he was allowed on indefinite leave from the hospital with no features at all of mania, of which he had suffered, I think, for about 5 or 6 years continuously, and was known as very disreputable, the most disruptive patient, I think, in the hospital, at least the ward. And some of the things he did were comical, but really, when you stop and think of how this man was suffering, it was appalling. And in 2.5 months, John Cade, stirring a solution of lithium, giving it to this gentleman for that 2.5 months, all those symptoms evaporated, and he was back as normal as you or I. That just, to me, then and still now, was extraordinary.
It was remarkable, and it seemed remarkable, I think, to John Cade himself. And he sort of knew that he was really onto something when you get that sort of result so quickly.
There's another collection of cards here that I think are more cryptic, and these are the descriptions of some of the treatments that John Cade used. Actually, one of them is extremely interesting. It's a list of all the different trace elements, or some of them, that John Cade actually experimented with. And the other cards really detail, again, they detail his methodical mind, but they detail how he actually analysed the urine when he was using the lithium. And what struck me was he must have been extremely interested in chemistry, Jack, because I don't know if the average doctor would have had this degree of knowledge.
No, it's not an area that I'm aware of where his training and that would have come from. But regarding the trace elements, having found that lithium was effective, he thought maybe some of the other elements, there's chemical biology of great interest here. So he explored whether some of the other elements might also be useful. But the particular gold mine he really was interested in was whether any of them affected schizophrenia,
Right.
which in the event he didn't. He actually did epidemiological studies around Victoria, looking for the differences in incidence of mental illness, including schizophrenia. He found stone fruit trees and all sorts of different incidences of the natural world that were associated with the different incidents of mental illness in some of the areas.
He was a keen observer, obviously a very fine observer of the world around him, and would follow that path wherever it took him. I always had the feeling he wasn't necessarily, in fact, I'm sure of this, he wasn't constrained by the views of others that would force him down a certain prefabricated path. And I'm sure in some way that was critical to the discovery of lithium.
Greg, John Cade rarely seemed to alter or add a comment to the cards, and so do you think that suggests anything about his approach as well?
You know what I thought of, and this may seem a little odd, I think of Mozart.
Exactly.
Because Mozart wrote music in the same way. He was described as someone having an idea and being able to transcribe it onto the page, almost complete it. And so when I saw those cards, that was the leap that I made. Because for most people to end up with a card like that, I think I'd be doing 2 or 3 drafts, and then I'd be refining it and then writing it out neatly. Whereas somehow, I think John Cade had this remarkable mind where he could think these things out, and then he could put it in an ordered, precise manner, and he could put it on the page without having to make a challenge. I think that's just the way he was. And I think that's a gift. And I think John Cade for a long time wasn't recognised for it, and still is not recognised to the degree I think he should be. I think it's also this area, this hospital, this university, Melbourne University, Royal Melbourne Hospital, because after your dad's initial discovery of lithium, there were other doctors and scientists in that period of time, that next decade, who really built upon his work. So for a brief period, this university, I think, was right at the forefront of psychopharmacology.
But not recognised.
But not recognised. And I wonder whether this university still does not recognise what it actually accomplished. The discovery of lithium, how to give it, watching for its side effects, understanding when toxic levels would occur, and even the taking of blood to make sure it's the right, just enough, but not too much, which we now take for granted. That was all done here at this university.
And specialised clinics established
That's right.
then at Royal Park for people who were on lithium.
It might be actually interesting to reflect a bit on why it took so long to penetrate around the world. And of course, there's a young doctor working by himself in a makeshift laboratory in a country hospital on the outskirts of a city called Melbourne, on the other side of the world from the major academic centres. But it took years and years, and it took a long time in the United States because, as you say, psychopharmacology was just starting. But which company is going to market lithium? And who's going to make any money from lithium? So the whole Freudian concept around the world of psychiatry, the whole international view of academia in the backwater of Australia, and the lack of a marketing opportunity, it was inevitable that this would be quite slow to be internationally recognised.
In fact, I don't think it was introduced officially into the US until 1970.
Yes, that's 20 years later. Yeah, that's right.
And I think it had a pretty rough trot in England, didn't it?
Yes.
Because there was some quite helpful commentary that seemed to stem more from a view that perhaps reflecting some of what you've said, but by people who hadn't actually ever used lithium in practice, but were ready to condemn it.
But there's something about being a clinician, seeing the change before your eye and seeing it repeated time and time again, that tells you a story that sometimes it's not easy to capture in research. And I think that's what happened.
How would you talk to current day students about lithium?
Well, and I do speak to students and young doctors all the time about lithium. But with respect to research, one of the things Cade said, he said a couple of things about research. He said everyone should do research because everyone will have moments during their career where they will observe something that others won't see. So observational research was dear to him and something that all doctors could do. I think that's important because in the contemporary world, research has become big business, very sophisticated. We now have teams of people doing things. So the lone researcher like John Cade is a rarity. But I would take his point that even in this sophisticated, complicated world of multi-million-dollar research, clinical observation is paramount. So I think that the desire for everyone to do research, that's one thing I think is John Cade's legacy. But secondly, everyone observes the world slightly differently. And your nuanced view of the world might allow you to see something that others don't see, and then you should write that up and share that. That's how I would speak to students.